Desidero ringraziare tutti voi che siete qui al Castello di Rivoli, pur sapendo che la conversazione che si terrà questa sera con l'artista Michael Rakowitz sarà in inglese, per lo più con brevi riassunti in italiano, quindi vi ringrazio molto della vostra gentilezza e generosità verso l'artista che parlerà in inglese. La mostra di Michael Rakowitz è la prima grande retrospettiva dedicata all'artista in Europa, l'unica retrospettiva che è stata realizzata nella sua vita che precede questa è la mostra al museo della sua città, al MCA, nel 2017 a Chicago. Questa mostra di Rivoli nasce dopo una lunga collaborazione con l'artista Michael Rakowitz, perché nel lontano 2005, in occasione della Triennale di Torino, la sindrome di Pantagruel, Michael Rakowitz espose proprio al terzo piano Castello un'opera che ritroverete in manica lunga stasera, chiamata Dull Roar, e che prende spunto dal fallimento e dalla caduta delle utopie moderniste sociali nell'architettura, e in particolare da un edificio Pruitt Eagle che fu abbattuto, un grande edificio che usciva dal pensiero, diciamo, originariamente di Le Corbusier, di un'architettura modulare, seriale, per accogliere democraticamente molte persone. Questo edificio nei primi anni 70 divenne poi un luogo di degrado, non fu mai creata l'area verde che doveva avere, eccetera, e fu demolito. E questa riflessione sulla demolizione di Pruitt Eagle nel lavoro di Michael Rakowitz è alla base di tutta la sua opera, che sostanzialmente si avvicina al problema della cura e della riparazione di ciò che si perde o viene rotto, distrutto, trafugato nella storia culturale umana, a partire dal corpo di un individuo all'oggetto di una cultura, il patrimonio culturale. L'ultima opera che noi esponiamo, la più recente nella mostra, è un rifacimento di alcuni pannelli dell'edificio a Nineve che fu distrutto da ISIS, e con il suo studio Michael Rakowitz, attraverso un lavoro che è sì di materia e di lavoro scultoreo, ma che è anche di tipo quasi psicologico, di durcharbeiten, di attraversare con un lavoro di elaborazione un lutto, il lutto di un artefatto culturale, segna alla fine la conclusione della mostra. Questa sera abbiamo Marianna Vecellio qui che parlerà e che è co-curatrice della mostra assieme a me e a Ivona Blaswick, la direttrice del Whitechapel Gallery di Londra, dove la mostra in un'altra configurazione ha preso avvio. Quindi la mostra nasce da una collaborazione tra le nostre due istituzioni e sarà presentata dopo Torino alla Jamil Foundation a Dubai per la prima retrospettiva nel mondo arabo. Importante per Michael Rakowitz, nato negli Stati Uniti d'America, di famiglia in parte della diaspora ebraica dell'Est Europa, da cui il nome Rakowitz, e da parte della nonna materna la diaspora ebraica sefardita che ha lasciato l'Iraq dopo, dopo gli anni 50 principalmente. I think I've said a few things which need no translation. In front of us, of the two of you, is the book that the Castello di Rivoli produced, and Marianna Vecellio did most of the work on that, because as director I take care of seating and parking lots and things like that. But anyway, Marianna did a great job, and I'd like to passare la parola a Marianna, che potrà brevemente introdurre il lavoro di Mike e entrare in questa conversazione. Grazie molto, thank you for being here.
Buonasera, benvenuti, grazie Caroline per questa introduzione e benvenuti al Castello di Rivoli e sono felice naturalmente di dare il benvenuto a Michael. Hi Mike, welcome here in Castello di Rivoli. Oggi il Castello di Rivoli inaugura la prima grande retrospettiva italiana dedicata all'artista americano iracheno. Rakowitz realizza sculture, disegni, video, installazioni, progetti performativi e collaborativi attraverso i quali racconta le grandi trasformazioni sociali e politiche causate dalle guerre, dalle ingiustizie, dalle disuguaglianze e dalle contraddizioni della modernizzazione e della globalizzazione della società contemporanea. La mostra raccoglie in un percorso appositamente pensato dall'artista per gli spazi della Manica Lunga un corpo di oltre 20 anni di attività ispirati all'architettura, alla geopolitica, alla cucina, all'archeologia e alla storia dal 700 a.C. ai giorni nostri. Un percorso cronologico che dà forma ad una narrazione poetica in cui storia, utopia e pragmatismo si incontrano. Dalle opere cosiddette della scultura sociale, come ad esempio Parasite o anche dal Roar, alle installazioni che invece affrontano il tema della distruzione dei patrimoni culturali, come l'opera in corso The Invisible Enemy Should Not Exist, che troverete in più forme, oppure What Does Will Rise, The Flesh is Yours, The Bones Are Ours. Rakowitz affronta la storia degli esseri umani, degli edifici e degli oggetti in continuo movimento nel tempo e nello spazio. Prima di passare alla conversazione vorrei dire alcune poche parole sulla nostra pubblicazione, il primo catalogo monografico in italiano e in inglese dedicato all'artista che diventa un approfondimento prezioso sul suo operato. Ampiamente illustrato, la pubblicazione presenta i saggi e l'intervista dei curatori e inoltre i testi di Ella Shoat, Abda Rashid e Nora Razian e un contributo dell'archeologo Bert Praxenthaler che ha lavorato all'opera realizzata in occasione di Documenta 13, che come sapete è stata curata dal nostro direttore, What Does Will Rise. Inoltre la pubblicazione presenta la prima cronologia scientifica che è accompagnata da testi antologici di molti dei critici e curatori che hanno affiancato Michael nel suo percorso ventennale. A questo punto, dopo questa breve introduzione in italiano, passiamo alla conversazione che sarà prevalentemente in inglese. So, Michael, I prepared for you a very maybe easy or simple question to start with. I would like to know how you decided to become an artist, how everything started, so that we have to start from something.
Wow. Shit, it's going to be a long night. Wow. Well, first of all, it's a pleasure to be here with you. Thank you so much, Marianna, for this incredible experience working together. I can't believe that it's here now. In terms of how I began to think about becoming an artist, I mean, there's a lot of moments. I think, I feel like when questions like this get asked, I should be lying down, and you should be behind me or something. But the earliest moments that I had, remembering making art, I think has to do with like drawing as a kid and being 2 or 3 years old, and I think the things that I was drawn to making or drawing were actually extinct species, like dinosaurs and whales that were overhunted, and those were the things that I was really good at, as a child. And I remember, the typical question from family members, like, what are you going to be when you grow up? And my dad is a doctor, and it was almost like an immediate knee-jerk reaction to say, oh, I'm going to be a doctor like Dad, And my father, would point out that I wasn't, and that I had something else going on. So it was actually, I think, it was nurtured quite a bit as I was growing up. And my parents would take us, when I say us, it's me and my two younger brothers, we would go to museums every weekend. And there was always this kind of narration of the works that were in museums and were in places like churches. I think we were the only Jews in New York that would happily go to churches to see artwork. And it was kind of this constant engagement with objects that held particular meaning. And the objects that were in the house, I grew up in my mother's parents' house, and so it was the house that they moved into when they left Baghdad, when they fled from Baghdad, and they still live there. And there's a lot of objects in that house. But all of those objects are kind of imbued with meaning about where it came from, and those objects that first populated that house were the things that they could bring out of Iraq. And they were humble things like bowls or, a small piece of artwork on the wall. I remember a cartoon of a man trying to get a donkey into a taxi. These were all things that I was told traveled with them. And then everything that they set up in the house was attempting to make sure that there was something from Iraq that was on the floor, there was something from Iraq on the walls, and what was coming out of Iraq, what was coming out of the kitchen was definitely from Iraq. So I always talk about my grandparents being like the first installation artists that I really, kind of came into contact with. And, but I think, there were times when I thought maybe I'll be a baseball player, but I'm not a baseball player. But I definitely found myself growing up with art and wanting to kind of continue that possibility to impact people through culture, because it was clear that it impacted my parents.
La mia domanda era riferita a come la sua pratica artistica è cominciata. È un artista che imbeve moltissimo la sua pratica di spunti narrativi, anche storici, come dicevamo prima. Per cui lui dice che ci sono stati molti momenti, è decisamente una domanda molto complessa, e che probabilmente da bambino, disegnando, quando faceva una pratica istintiva, disegnava dinosauri, mentre suo padre era un dottore, pensava che lui sarebbe potuto essere un dottore, invece probabilmente capiva che ciò che lo interessava maggiormente era la scoperta del potenziale degli oggetti, l'engagement con gli oggetti, la relazione con gli oggetti, la scoperta che gli oggetti sono imbevuti di significato, e queste numerose possibilità. So from this, in fact, like your story, your origins are full of references. Your maternal family comes from Iraq, but she born in Bombay. Mm-hmm. While traveling to United States, while your paternal family, comes from East Europe. So all these, I would say, the exodus, but also migration and the journey, which becomes a multicultural approach, becomes a prism of perspectives. All this is very important in your practice. For instance, the traveling or the exodus or migration is very strongly important and visible in your practice?
I think so. I mean, I think in a way it's something that's just normal to me, is this idea of not being in a place where one, necessarily sees the primal scene of their family's history. Like like most of us are coming from someplace else, but what I'm interested in is that's even though there's loss in some cases of not being able to go back to a place, there's all these things that get gained along the way, that the provenance of who we are as people, becomes so much more complicated. Mm-hmm. And it's additive more than it is reductive or subtractive. It's something that has the potential to be like a stone that gets bigger and starts to take on different kinds of sediment. It doesn't, it's not a homogeneous thing. I mean, it's not a homogeneous thing. It starts to take on other layers and other characteristics, and I've always found that interesting. And that's one of the reasons why I'm like interested in spice mixes. There's that spice mixes over the years, whether they're curries or in the case of Iraq, baharat, there's always things that get added as people move from one place to another. And so I'm interested in that, because I think it makes it all the more complex that like, even though I am dealing with Iraq, I'm also dealing with being American, being subject to American pop culture and actually loving a lot of it. And so being able to have all those things side by side and defying history, which seems to go from like, the bottom up to the surface, or, we trick ourselves into believing that it's linear when it's not, and so I think that, what you're talking about in these, these opening comments about, where the family comes from, I think it was very liberating. Like growing up in a house where, my Iraqi grandmother was a big baseball fan, and my dad was a huge baseball fan. And you would think that would make them connect. But the problem was that my dad is a Yankees fan, and my grandmother was a Brooklyn Dodgers fan. And that's deadly, but the reason she was a Brooklyn Dodgers fan was because the King of Iraq was a Brooklyn Dodgers fan. And he was a Brooklyn Dodgers fan because they were the first team that let an African American onto their team. So for her it was symbolic, but like there was a lot of tension in the house that, looking back on it now, I think is really lovely,
Yeah. Beh, io ho domandato in che modo la sua storia è entrata in gioco nel suo lavoro, e anche il tema del viaggio, dell'esodo, della migrazione, e l'approccio multiculturale, ciò che una delle dichiarazioni, delle affermazioni significative a mio avviso, ma tra le varie che non riuscirò a tradurre tutto purtroppo, è sia il concetto di provenienza quanto poi sia un concetto labile, no? Cioè non poter tornare indietro, il tema del viaggio come un mix, no? Come se fossero delle spezie, ma anche il fatto che noi pensiamo che le cose siano lineari, e che per lui questa sua provenienza dall'Iraq è stata in qualche modo liberatoria. Allora ha raccontato questo aneddoto della sua famiglia, che sono stati tifosi di 2 squadre opposte, però era un po' un modo per convivere. Thinking about migration and trip and so on, I'm thinking about the first work you have produced, one of your earlier work, which is Parasite, which is here in the exhibition, which is basically a work that you have realized for people that has no home. Parasite is define a social sculpture. This, I don't know if it is a critic definition, or if it's something that you have used to define your work. So I would like to know what is a social sculpture for you, if you agree with this statement.
Well, I mean, I'm going to fail at defining the correct art historical reference to social sculpture, which I think comes out of Beuys, Joseph Beuys. But if I think about social sculpture and what that means to me, I think about there being a kind of interaction that causes something to emerge. And what I've always tried to do with my work is to slow things down so that conversations can happen. And that project, which I've been doing for more than 20 years now, is very much an engagement with each person for whom I build the shelters. So it's a project that began as architecture, but soon became also about portraiture, because I was designing not only to meet the needs of each person that was living in them, but also their desires. So the different colors that they might be, or the different features they might have with different pocket windows and things like that. Like those things would not come out of the project unless there was a social part of it. And I think all art, is social. There is a social element to being in front of an artwork and being moved by it and transformed by it, But I think in this case, the social was what guided me. It's what sculpted the work. And so the exertion of those kinds of forces onto the work is something that, really is about a conversation that happens. And that conversation only happens if you're allowing for those things to emerge and to go slow, So, and it also happens with cooking, as I've done my culinary projects, like Enemy Kitchen, like the fact that the cooking that I learned from my mother takes so long, that it is tedious, it's also something that's related to sculpture. Like when you're making, in Iraq, if you're making a kebab, which is a kind of dumpling, it is very much like sculpture. And I find that when the hands are doing something, it frees up the mind to do something else. And so it allows for those spaces where the things are being cooked together, where the meals are being cooked together, to allow for the social to emerge in a manner that doesn't feel like a seminar or something. So, yeah.
When you say that these work are portrait, can you explain a little bit better what does it mean? Because maybe the public is not, do not know so well this work.
Well, if I think about some of the projects that some of the shelters that I've built, when I'm talking with somebody who's existing in this space of our cities, which is a space of urgency, and it's a space of invisibility. People become invisible when they're not living in houses. When they're actually on the streets, we've found a way to make them completely invisible. And in the sense of opening up a conversation about this technology that I'm introducing, which is a very simple thing about harnessing the air that's coming out of the ventilation duct.
Maybe I can explain to the public what is Parasite. Parasite is this first, forse è meglio che lo dico in italiano però. Parasite è uno dei primi lavori realizzato nel 97 da Michael, che consiste in sono rifugi temporanei trasportabili fatti con materiale assolutamente economico, inespensivo, dicevo, e con buste di plastica. Queste strutture sono a tutti gli effetti dei rifugi che si agganciano ai sistemi di ventilazione, si agganciano all'esterno degli edifici, ai sistemi di ventilazione per diventare dei rifugi per i senza tetto, i rifugi riscaldati. E gli ho domandato un aspetto che sembrava essere interessante, cioè lui li ha definiti dei ritratti e gli ho chiesto in che modo li definisci queste opere dei portrait, dei ritratti. Allora, innanzitutto perché questi rifugi lui li realizza per i vari senza tetto con i quali interagisce in conversazioni e molto frequentemente questi rifugi sono proprio customizzati sulle necessità e le esigenze dei loro abitanti e pertanto sottolinea un aspetto molto interessante che è quello dell'invisibilità. I senza tetto sono qualcosa, diciamo, che forse non si vuole vedere, e per lui è molto importante riflettere sul concetto di visibile e invisibile rispetto a questo. Yes. Sì, ecco, potete vederlo qui alle nostre spalle.
Right, and I think some of the images you'll see are the drawings that I've done for different people. So in this case, Michael McGee, who was a homeless person in New York City, living near Penn Station, requested a shelter because he read in New York's laws. He went to the New York Public Library and looked up the city's bylaws and found that it's illegal to have a tent in public space, and making camping illegal in New York City. But the city also has to define what a tent is in the law. And they define it as a structure that's standing about 1 meter tall and capable of having somebody inside it. And so all the shelters up to that point were being made about, 1.5 meters tall or, bigger, like these big bubbles. And he said, well, what if we bring it down below 1 meter? What if it's more like an inflatable sleeping bag, or a body extension? And so from Michael McGee, he was more or less finding a way to circumvent the laws of the city so that he could enter into a more confusing language with the police, that if the police saw it and they said it's a shelter, and he would take out the city's bylaws and say it's not a shelter because, and they would measure it and they would let him go, But then there's also different shelters that I built where somebody has asked for the plastic on the bottom to be green and the plastic on the top to be blue, because they wanted to have like the perfect color of like the earth in a painting and then the perfect color of the sky. And those are things that were so beautiful to be able to address. And so it wasn't this top-down design, coming from me as somebody who was an artist studying in an architecture program in graduate school, but it was actually being guided by people who had this experience of living on the streets, and it didn't reduce to just this question of what's necessary and what's needed or what's the most urgent. It was also about what somebody desires. And I think that that became an important point in my practice, to recognize the fact that people in these urgent situations are still, there's still love stories and there's still humor. And that comes through, I think, with the 100 or so shelters that I built in the 20 years that the project has gone on.
Ecco, questo progetto è un progetto che è ancora in corso, sono 20 anni, avrà costruito circa 200 shelter, you said?
About 100.
Un centinaio di rifugi che raccontano le necessità e i desideri anche di coloro che li abitano. You said before the importance of architecture because you formed as you formed as stone carver first, then you studied graphic art, and then at MIT from 96 to 98 together with John Jonas, Krzysztof Wodiczko, and Dennis Adams. And I would like to know which importance has architecture in your practice.
Well, I think, so I started out, yes, as a stone carver and wanting to be a sculptor, but when you were an American art student going into art school in the early 1990s, your parents also wanted you to study graphic design because it was a way of making money. And what I appreciated about graphic design, though, was that it seemed to be a way in which to introduce art and poetry into the public sphere through the multiple, through publication. And I was very interested in how nomadic that was and how agile that could be, that there would be moments in which you expect for something to work a particular way, but there was an opportunity to introduce it as art, but not through a gallery or something. But then that led me to thinking about, what are the other spaces in which one could introduce art, and I became very interested in public art, and the public art that I was influenced by people like Alan Wexler and Dennis Adams and Krzysztof Wodiczko, and the group that's called Sight that was run by James Wines and Alison Skye, were finding ways in which to embed the art within the experience of the architecture or the furniture, the urban furniture throughout the city. And it became a method of engaging the public where there wasn't necessarily some kind of disclaimer that this was art, that it could be something that was more confusing, that it didn't need to cordon itself off you know, from the rest of an experience in the world, and it could invade the everyday environment. So architecture became a way to do that because it was what I was surrounded by in urban spaces in the US. And it was an interesting way of also like getting, in my first experience, understanding what it was in antiquity, that architecture and art did not have separate words. And so that was very interesting to me as well. So it was this dispersal, not so much a disavowalment that it was art, but the fact that it was a dispersal into other spaces. And so architecture became this place where I could understand the social networks that define cities. And I say social network as a way of talking about how people are connected to one another, not in the kind of like post-internet terminology. And so buildings became symbolic of that. But in a project like Parasite, the individual became much more important.
I'm thinking about also Dal Rohr, for instance, which is a work that has a architectural reflection. It makes a reflection on how architecture can be of a social importance, for instance, but it can also be the end of modernism, so the end of utopia.
Yes, indeed. I mean, I think that a project like Dal Rohr, which picks up on the story of Pruitt-Igoe, which were these visionary, or they were supposed to be visionary, almost utopian social housing buildings that went up in the mid-1950s and had more or less been so compromised by the time they opened up because the Housing Act of 1949 was repealed, and so Minoru Yamasaki, who was the designer, wanted to incorporate what Corbusier called the three essentials of urbanism, which were sun, space, and greenery. All those things had to be rolled back, and so he was very passionate about designing, you know, making good design, safe, democratic, good design for people that needed it most. It ended up being these concrete boxes that were less about democracy and more about control and containment. And so it's a design that essentially fails, but it's because of the inefficiency of the US to be able to foreground and protect, you know, the kind of social services that allowed for something like the Housing Act of 1949 to be introduced. You know, so it's a mournful piece in a way because it shows what could have been a visionary moment in American architecture as something that not only collapses, but is then almost like dragged out as an example for people to condemn social housing in the US and to do things like declare the ridiculous threshold that Charles Jenks pointed out, that when the dynamite blew up the buildings when they were condemned in 1972, that it was the moment when modernism ended and postmodernism began. You know, so it was almost like this gleeful abandonment of any kind of like humanism or social responsibility when it came to design and architecture.
Gli ho domandato la sua relazione con l'architettura, dal momento che tra i vari studi che ha fatto si è formato come intagliatore della pietra, ma poi ha studiato grafica, poi è passato a un corso di arte pubblica all'MIT. Gli ho chiesto quanto è importante l'architettura nel suo approccio e soprattutto in relazione a quest'opera che vedrete in mostra più tardi, che si chiama Dal Rohr, che è un'opera che illustra un modello di un gonfiabile che si gonfia e si sgonfia ogni 4 minuti, osservabile da una rampa, e questo lavoro allude alla distruzione del complesso di case popolari Prutigo, che è stato un simbolo del modernismo diciamo sociale, disegnato dall'architetto Minoru Yamasaki, che poi è colui che ha disegnato il World Trade Center. È stato un edificio che doveva seguire le impostazioni di Le Corbusier del sole, verde e spazio, cioè era un'architettura sociale che poi in realtà invece è diventato una sorta di luogo di segregazione, pertanto è stato demolito nel 72, per cui indicava l'importanza appunto dell'approccio dell'architettura stessa nella sua pratica, che a sua volta è un approccio che diciamo esprime una serie di contraddizioni. Questo edificio mostrava ciò che poteva essere, mostra un movimento visionario che poi in realtà alla fine invece diventerà un fallimento, per cui dice della fine del modernismo e l'inizio del postmoderno. A very important element in your practice is the Participatory Act. Many of your work are often the result of a process of participation, of a sharing of experience with the local community, for instance. I'm thinking about White Man Got No Dreaming, for instance, but also the other work, The Flesh is Yours, The Bones Are Ours, in which you have carved the books on the occasion of a workshop.
What Dust Will Rise.
Oh, sorry, What
Yeah.
Dust Will Rise,
Yeah.
but yes, that's right. But also The Flesh is Yours, The Bones Are Ours to work with for the frottage, for instance.
Yes.
Now you've worked with the artists in preparing the frottage. So this is a very important aspect in your practice. Where this necessity come from? Why is so important for you participation?
Well, I think participation is something that I find to be a really, again, it kind of goes back to Parasite in some way, of realizing that I could only ever do almost like the most boring part of the project, which was to come up with this attachment to the building, you know, which for me also was exciting because it was the poetry of, you know, one building providing a kind of CPR to another and breathing life into lungs. And if I think about the projects that you mentioned, and for instance, going to White Man Got No Dreaming in Sydney, Australia, one of the things that's wonderful about working with Carolyn Christoph-Bakarjiev is that as she was artistic director of that biennial, we spent a lot of time listening and going to places like the Northern Territory in Australia and talking to people from the Aboriginal Indigenous Australian communities. But then it turned out that there was a place in the middle of Sydney where there was this resistance, this Indigenous Australian resistance to the encroachment of white Australia into one part of South Sydney. And it was this moment where there was a kind of a breaking point where the government of Australia wasn't going to grant land rights to Indigenous Australians anytime soon. So they took it upon themselves to go to auctions in the early 1970s, and they started to buy one Victorian row house next to another Victorian row house next to another until they had an entire island in the city. And they had these designs for what would have been a visionary, the first example of visionary Indigenous Australian architecture, where it was like the simple act of knocking down the fences between all the different houses and sharing the yard space, you know. And it was an incredibly simple but provocative design. And you know, without getting into the whole narrative of the project, this is a vision that ends up being deferred and almost dies. And I was interested in figuring out ways in which to work with members of that community to be able to tell that story. But I know what my hands do, and I know what the hands of other people do. And I'm very interested in provenance. I'm interested in the hands that shape things, you know, and where materials come from. And so when it came to making this iteration of Tatlin's Monument to the Third International, which you can see in the exhibition, I wanted it to come from one of those row houses that had fallen into a kind of derelict shape that the city was prohibiting the Aboriginal Housing Company from demolishing. But I also wanted it to be built by the architects who were hired to make the Indigenous Australian design. And I thought that that was a way of actually activating and imbuing the materials with something, some kind of aura that would never have come from my own hands. But it came from the interaction, from this moment of the social that we talked about before. And the same thing with the books that come from What Thus Will Rise. It's made from the travertine, these destroyed books that were burned in Germany during World War II. Those books are being reconstructed from the travertine that the Bamyan Buddhas were made from, and they were carved to a certain point by Abbas al-Haddad, who was, or is, an Afghan stone carver who was hunted by the Taliban. But he only brought it to a certain point because he realized that a lot of those books that were destroyed in the bombing of Kassel in Germany, a lot of them were like Bibles and had pictures of Jesus on them. And he said, I can't do that. And so then those books were airlifted out of Afghanistan and sent to the most Catholic stone carving city in the world, Bolzano, where they were finished with like the Jesus faces and everything. You know, so it's that provenance, you know, that it's coming from these different places and it's involving all those different hands. And so for me, that becomes really important. So in The Flesh is Yours, the Bones are Ours, when you look at those frottage that are in the exhibition space, I think it's really important to know that a good number of those rubbings come from about 400 different buildings throughout Istanbul that were ornamented by Armenian craftspeople. And those ornaments are the silent witnesses to the Armenian genocide and the disappearance of much of that city's Armenian community. But there are still Armenian children, there's still an Armenian, you know, community in Istanbul, and high school students from an Armenian school helped me make those frottage. You know, and so it's their hands that are convening with like the ancestors in some way and coming up with these shrouds, you know, which are hanging in there. And for me, that means everything, you know, and it's very different than if I had done them. Does that make sense? Does that?
Yes, definitely. Gli ho chiesto quanto è importante l'atto partecipativo, che è un aspetto estremamente presente in moltissima parte del suo lavoro, che è il frutto di conversazioni, di incontri, di workshop, ma su più fronti, su più livelli. E sintetizzerò molto brevemente dicendo che ciò che lui intende raccontare sicuramente è la storia delle persone, ma soprattutto c'è un'aura che avviene attraverso la partecipazione. Si costruisce un'aura che è fatta del contributo, dell'innesto di numerosi aspetti, e citava tre opere che sono in mostra: White Man Got No Dreaming, un'opera che ha realizzato in occasione della 16ª Biennale di Sydney nel 2008, insieme a Caroline, dove si sono trovati a viaggiare e incontrare moltissima gente, soprattutto le comunità aborigene. E poi What Thus Will Rise, l'opera realizzata per Documenta, dove anche lì c'erano degli intagliatori afghani, e poi gli intagliatori invece del nord Italia, che erano coloro che potevano intagliare con le raffigurazioni divine, perché gli intagliatori musulmani non l'avrebbero potuto fare. E poi The Flesh is Yours, the Bones are Ours, dove addirittura c'erano delle scuole con dei bambini che sono stati insieme a lui a fare il frottage, no? So going through this, you spoke about destruction, which is another important topic. Following the American invasion in 2003 in Iraq, you start dealing with the Iraq culture that brought you to a further topic, which is the destruction of cultural heritage. I'm referring, for instance, to the restaging of your grandfather company, Davidson & Co. in New York in the work Return, to the ongoing project, The Invisible Enemy Should Not Exist, that is in the show. And so destruction led to reconstruction. But is this possible? Is possible to rebuild what is destroyed?
Well, the short answer is no, but I've gone through several years of referring to these objects that I make as reconstructions, and that felt deeply unsatisfying since I started that project in 2006. There's been, unfortunately, just so much more that's been lost and destroyed, and now there's this push to 3D print and to 3D scan, anything that has either disappeared or is at risk. And I find that really, I don't want to say that it shouldn't be done, but I find that there's a lack of a certain kind of criticality when it comes to that idea that one can just 3D scan preemptively and then rebuild, because it ignores the fact that these objects are attached to communities. And being the son of two Jews who were born after the Holocaust, and my mother, coming from an Arab Jewish background and knowing all that was lost there as nationalisms emerged in the Middle East, and then, growing up and learning about the fact that when books burn, people burn, the fact that you talk about 3D printing the artifacts that have been lost. You can't 3D print the DNA of the people who perish alongside them. And so for me, it is always important that these objects are reappearances, that they're ghosts, that will one day probably disappear again, and that they're made from vulnerable materials, and they can never actually be the thing that they're conjuring or trying to conjure, but they're reminding. And there's a haunting, ghosts do two things, depending on who's looking at it. You're either haunted or you're reassured or comforted by the ghost, depending on who you are looking at these things. It's a reminder, it's a monument, it's an admonishment. There's all these different things that it can do, but I've been very clear with myself that it can never ever be the same again, but I'm also somebody that believes in retaining the scar, that one doesn't try to disappear the scar, because this is the only opportunity to let people know that something unacceptable has been visited on the body that's received the scar. And in this sense, for me, the brokenness that we're all experiencing and that we're all a part of is something that becomes visible in our broken parts, coming together or not. And that, for me, is part of the work, but it also has a story. Brought up my grandfather's company. I did this store in New York, reopening his company to try to import Iraqi dates to the US for the first time in over 40 years, which I can't get into the story now about the crazy route that it all took and the kind of the complex sort of bittersweet ending, but I was in this store in Brooklyn that was empty, because we didn't have any of the Iraqi dates. What I had were date syrup cans that said they were product of Lebanon, but I found out from everybody in the import-export industry that they were actually product of Iraq, but they couldn't say that they were. So I looked at this date syrup can like it was a terrified object, like it was an object that was suffering from xenophobia and couldn't say where it was from because of the sanctions. And then the sanctions have basically, more or less continued because of the fact that it's impossible to get anything out of Iraq anymore. And this way of looking at that provenance of that object, of that commodity, the empty store made me think about the empty museum. And when you sit with an object long enough, it tells you about itself, and it can also tell you what it wants to be. And it was sitting in that empty store that I decided that all of those objects that were looted from the National Museum of Iraq that have disappeared should come back wearing the skin of those things that couldn't tell us where it was from. So it became a very troubled provenance and also showed the urgency with which they were built.
Io ho domandato a Michael quanto è importante il concetto della distruzione e soprattutto se è possibile ricostruire ciò che è distrutto. Gli ho fatto questa domanda all'interno, diciamo, del lavoro che lui comincia a seguire a partire dal 2003, quando le truppe americane invadono l'Iraq. Lui in quel momento incomincia a seguire all'inizio, a esplorare la cultura irachena, che poi lo porterà, questo suo studio, questa sua necessità, lo porterà a confrontarsi col tema della distruzione del patrimonio culturale. Ecco, rispetto a questo, gli ho chiesto appunto se è possibile ricostruire ciò che è distrutto e lui dice la risposta semplice è no. Poi ha raccontato di come adesso esistono queste macchine 3D che stampano gli oggetti, che sono stati per esempio oggetti saccheggiati dal Museo dell'Iraq, e che lui non vorrebbe essere contro queste macchine, però in realtà poi non sostituiscono, cioè non riproducono l'oggetto, non lo riportano in vita. E che occorre, è necessaria una forma di criticalità, chiaramente, rispetto a tutto questo. Lui è comunque un figlio di genitori ebrei e c'è stato l'Olocausto, ci sono stati molti dolori che non possono essere dimenticati, per cui è difficile ricostruire ciò che è distrutto, non si può ricostruire il DNA delle persone, dice, non potrà mai più essere uguale. Un paio di altri concetti che vorrei portare alla vostra attenzione, sicuramente il concetto di cicatrice, le scar di cui lui parla sono le cicatrici che devono essere visibili, le cicatrici devono essere visibili. E rispetto a questo, in una conversazione che abbiamo avuto, volevo condividere con voi, when you said about the bandage, il suo insegnante Krzysztof Wodiczko gli parlava dell'importanza del bendaggio. Il bendaggio è qualcosa che cura, ma che fa vedere che c'è la ferita. Is healing, but it shows that there's some scar behind. So this is very important. Vorrei chiudere, forse perché stiamo per aprire la mostra, con un'ultima domanda. Why you have titled the show Imperfect Binding?
Well, that came from yet another site-specific work that I'm really honored to have done here at the Castello di Rivoli. And when Carolyn invited me to make a work that engages with the Cerruti collection, which is now a part of the Castello di Rivoli, the Cerruti Villa, it was so exciting to read about who this Francesco Federico Cerruti was. And he was an industrialist, well, he was a bookbinder, you know, who introduced perfect binding to Italy. And for those of you who don't know what perfect binding is, it's, you know, think of your telephone book, where it's basically, if you think of telephone books anymore, right? But, you know, it's like it's perfectly glued on the side, and he made the telephone books for all of Italy. And as you know from past work, I've been interested in books because of what they represent, but also I've been collecting for 20 years these books that are from the Iraqi Jewish community that left Iraq in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. And all of those books were actually printed bound in Livorno, Italy. I'm not totally sure why, but the Great Synagogue of Baghdad had a deal with Salomon Belforte and company in Livorno. And these books that I collect are the ones that are totally destroyed. Their binding has fallen apart as the people that use them have been forced to move from one place to another. So they end up bearing a little bit of that trauma of migration, and the books start to fall apart. And in Jewish tradition, when a holy book falls apart, you're supposed to bury it. And Cerruti gave me the idea of thinking about not burying it, but maybe finding a way to bring it back, to resurrect it, but let it have its scar. But all of those books that I bought that are and I've collected were stitched together. And so Sara Catanacci, who is at the Castello, also introduced me to Luciano Fagnola, who's a local bookbinder and was a friend of Cerruti. And Cerruti apparently had this beautiful correspondence with him where Fagnola is doing this very intricate hand binding, and Cerruti always said something like, "You're more free than I could ever be," you know? But I love the fact that Fagnola, Mr. Fagnola's hands are now the ones that have rebound these books. So Imperfect Binding is an installation that's in the Castello as part of the Cerruti collection exhibition, and it's also upstairs. So what you'll see are two repaired books where you can see that it now has been resurrected. I don't have to bury it. It can be used again, but he exposed the scar, you know, of where it had to be rebound. And I thought about it not being perfect binding, but imperfect binding, because in Judaism, perfection is not a birthright. It's something that you look to accomplish, but it's always expected that you'll fail at it. You know, we always fall short. And I thought that also it was a beautiful title for a retrospective, which is always imperfect. All these works that I've done are site-specific to some other place, and they can only ever be a fraction of themselves here or in any location. And there's always things that get left out. So it just seemed like a really wonderful way of taking the work, the most recent work that I've done, and letting it be the kind of overlay for everything that I've done to this point.
Thank you, Mike. E concludiamo con questa domanda. Gli ho chiesto perché ha titolato questa mostra Imperfect Binding, e questo titolo nasce dalla collaborazione che ha fatto Michael con la Fondazione Cerruti. Ci sono due lavori, uno al Castello e uno lo troverete in Manica Lunga, che sono ispirati alla storia del filantropo torinese Francesco Federico Cerruti, il quale era un grande collezionista che fece una fortuna attraverso il brevetto della perfetta rilegatura, che è una rilegatura che si ottiene attraverso la colla. C'è un sistema di colla per cui quel libro è estremamente compatto, per cui si elimina il filo, fondamentalmente. Ecco. Allora, a proposito di questo, lui dice che tra l'altro l'opera nasce anche da una passione che lui ha per i libri, che lui colleziona libri ebraici iracheni che sono spesso estremamente rovinati e che secondo il giudaismo dovrebbero essere distrutti, che invece lui conserva. Allora averli rilegati attraverso un contatto, che poi era anche una persona vicina a Cerruti, li ha riportati in vita, per cui ha risuscitato i libri. Tuttavia questi libri, che sono rilegati con un sistema per cui la spina ha un rivestimento in un materiale trasparente, per cui si può intravedere la cicatrice di nuovo. Inoltre Imperfetto è una mostra imperfetta, perché è una mostra che non è, non potrà mai essere completa, e perché non è possibile essere perfetti, questo secondo il giudaismo. Io spero di aver tradotto almeno qualcosa delle tante cose che ha detto Michael, davvero straordinarie. E thank you, Michael, so much for your conversation.